wonderful to be outside. Yes, thank you for putting us here this morning. Like so many others, and Dar most recently, I have to open with thanksgiving to the musicians first, who drew us yesterday and today, who drew us into music and created an immediate sense of community by asking us, teaching us, and then asking us to sing along. To Terry, you evinced the centrality of women, both sacred and secular, in Native American consciousness. Mother and father creators, grandmother earth, 5 bands, tribes, where women choose the chief, imagine that. And the conference brochure described 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, as nurturing model of sustainable agriculture. Looking around, I see 75% to 80% women attending this conference. And I have to ask, why is this? Where are the men? Father Tim, he asked us for suggestions. His address is here. I thought he would be here, and I wrote this thinking to say it to him. I would suggest that you speak of the Creator as mother and father. Feminist theologians have reinterpreted the theology of the all-male Trinity. Doreen Glim, from the Congregation of St. Joseph, knows the name of the prominent feminist theologian at Fordham. She tells me she just retired, but who has written an excellent book on this. And I speak from lived experience because my brother John, at 79, a fully functioning, healthy Catholic priest, read the book. And he wrote me afterwards and said, quote, "I'm a feminist." Eric, you're clarifying that we do not take our breath for the next breath. We are given our next breath. That change of one word to given upends our anthropomorphic version of living life in our world. I will remember it especially walking, biking, canoeing, and also when I go for my medical checkup and they say, take a deep breath. Terry later talked about how the intellect dominates too much, and for us to draw upon heart, soul, senses, emotional and social intelligence. I was a math and a major and environmental engineering in graduate school. I mainly worked with facts, and I thought that poets worked with heart, soul, feelings, the intelligence of our senses, our intellect, social and emotional intelligence. However, she made me rethink about how ideas gain life. And I now think of them, the metaphor of seeds. Seeds, of course, need soil, moisture to germinate. I think of those as the soul, the heart, the senses. And then in order to grow into maturity, they need the sun or light. And that's the role of the intellect in ideas. But good ideas need all of these. Dar, I'm speaking to yesterday, but actually today as well. What you learned from your time with Dina and Stan, and I'm quoting you, let go of results of your actions and focus on the action, feeling morally obliged to do everything you can as a response to the fact that we are now off the cliff. I do want to, and you said that you go to the mountains to listen to Misa. I do want to bring up the reality for so many who live in cities. Industrialization led to urbanization. Today, 55% of the world lives in cities. I'm talking Africa as well as, which is rapidly urbanizing. And it's projected that 68% will live in cities by 2050, if we still exist. So cities have disconnected us from nature. Where do poor people living in inner cities go to find these misa? Many years ago, in the 1990s, I visited community gardens in inner cities across the United States. So North Philadelphia, primarily completely African-American community. Cabrini Green, a horrific public housing project in Chicago, again, primarily African-American. A jail project in San Francisco, because of arrest rates, they were primarily African-American and Latino. And Harlem, to visit the greening of Harlem. And essentially, I wrote a book following that after interviewing many of these gardeners and describing the projects. It was called A Patch of Eden. And it was in the greening of Harlem that I asked the gifted director of that, Bernadette Cozart. She worked for the Parks Department in Manhattan, and she conceived this idea of the greening of Harlem. Well, I'm in a poor community. I'm looking at her gardens, most of which had flowers. And I asked her, why are you not growing more edible vegetables? And she said, food feeds the body, but flowers feed the soul. And I would say that the situation of so many in the world, poor living in cities, is that their misa can only be a small community garden where they will work with the resilience that you have spoken about, Maureen, to create a livable, sustainable world for the time that they can. Melissa, I was moved and inspired by the focus of your anthology. Eco-justice rather than climate crisis. And the example you gave of this with respect to the Amazon, which is, of course, the most biodiverse ecosystem in the world. But you also pointed out that it has the largest, most diverse indigenous tribes in the world. Nature is not without people. So I want to finish by thanking Maureen and John. John, particularly because you sustained this for 21 years. It is remarkable. Given how short-lived everything is, fast and short-lived everything is. Speaking of fast, I have loved the tempo of this conference. It's perfect. And it isn't just because I'm 75, going on 76. It is because we need this. Maureen, the brilliance behind the incredible detail and the gifted people speaking here. I also want to thank those who fed us, and will feed us. Blessed are those who feed the hungry, and you are blessed indeed for such fresh, delicious, healthful food. So now I'll go on to what I was asked to do. I just want to say, I have spoken at so many conferences, many of them sort of university-based. Do you think people get up and call the other speakers? No way. Lest they lessen themselves and their sense of self to acknowledge someone else's work. Do people applaud after talks? No. As we're doing today, but yesterday we were silent. And that too spoke. It was a very full, deep silence. You don't get that either. You get very thin air. Yes. So in response to our conference theme, How Then Shall We Live? I've written 3 meditations, concluding with 2 principles by which to live. I'll open with my own daily philosophy. Make the most imperatively of what we have and can do now, with an emphasis on excellence in every endeavor, all the while facing that the earth we have been born into, no matter our age or generation, is less rich in ecological diversity, less habitable for all creatures, and manifests little evidence of a major restoration in the near future. My first meditation concerns the equality of women and what it has to do with peace and security at home and in the world. And my second meditation, a sequel, is on how peace is intimately linked with the fate of the earth. On the eve of World War II, the iconic writer Virginia Woolf responded to a male attorney's question about how to prevent war. Your question, she replied, is how to prevent war. Ours is, and she was referring to the majority of women across history, Margaret Thatcher and others like her accepted. Our question is, why fight? Peace and the security of nations are powerfully linked with the equality of women, though the rare power broker, be they diplomat or military liaison, is conscious of this. I traveled a year ago to Ghana to participate in the International African Women's Feminist Peace Conference, which was organized by the more than 100-year-old organization, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, what it's called WILP. My interviews with African women and a few feminist men during their sessions on feminist peace in Africa only reinforced the mounting conviction that the fate of nations, and thus the fate of the earth, is bound up with the status of women. Consider that feminist revolutions to gain human rights and equality for women have freed and saved the lives of many, many millions of women and girls, without weapons, without fists, without a drop of blood spilled. The underside of this, hundreds of millions of girls and women have been injured, harmed, and killed by patriarchal institutions and by misogynist men. Why? Because they are female. How? With female infanticide, with weapons and rape in war, with fists and rape at home, through the commercial sex trade, and through the slow gender violences of personal and public inequality. Shall we also call this the Wetiko disease? Consider this staggering finding. More lives were lost in the 20th century through violence against women in all its forms than during all 20th century wars. Yet while thousands of monuments throughout the United States honor those who gave their lives for their country in war, only one, the first of its kind, is currently being planned for women who lost their lives giving birth to our country's children. Recent groundbreaking analysis validates the conviction that national and international peace and security are integrally related to women's equality. A team of researchers, including security studies experts and statisticians, has created the largest global database on the status of women. It's called Women's Stats. And they compared the level of security and conflict within 175 countries. They were using a UN index for that, to the overall security and equality of women in those countries. Their findings are profoundly illuminating for global security and world peace. The degree of equality of women within countries predicts best, better than level of democracy, better than level of wealth or poverty, or ethno-religious identity, how peaceful or conflict-ridden their countries are. Further, democracies with higher levels of violence against women are less stable and more likely to choose force rather than diplomacy to resolve conflict. At the structural level of governance, the glaring absence of women in government as well as international bodies such as the UN, at every echelon, particularly the highest, is another form of discriminatory violence that robs women of political power and consequently the world of security. Currently, only 20 women hold the office of head of state or head of government, a mere 6% versus 93.7% male international leaders. So what difference do women bring to issues of political power and national security? Nearly 200 women in politics surveyed in 65 countries agreed women's presence in politics increases the amount of attention given to social welfare, legal protection, and transparency in government and business. Work this of them expressed that women in government restore citizens' trust in government. Research has shown that where women's inclusion in conflict resolution is prioritized, peace is more probable. They go longer in terms of trying to resolve conflict farther, especially when women are in a position to influence decision-making. There's a wonderful book by an African activist who won the Nobel Prize, who organized with other women to finally end the unending war in Liberia, which spilled over to the Sierra Leone. Nozizwe Madlala Routledge, a former member of parliament and assistant secretary of defense in the post-apartheid South Africa government, has turned the crucible of her experience in government into a lifelong commitment to equality for women in political decision-making. The end of military white rule, she told me, did not end patriarchal militarized rule. You enter office, she said, to change government, and government changes you. Being elected to office is not enough. Women and men of integrity must transform government. So here I think of the spark of hope for transformation of government, offered especially by the 4 women of color recently elected to Congress. Trump diabolically denigrates them. They are the antithesis of his heartless, authoritarian, white nationalist worldview and behavior. Another speaker at the conference, Dr. Kate Adu-Adeku, she is a professor at the University of Ghana. She concretized her message of gender equality. Quote, break down gender roles in the home to begin to change society. Have boys do dishes and have them learn to nurture younger children. She said there is a feedback from home to the top of society. Our Ghana conference opened with a few minutes of silence to honor the great Ghanaian statesman, peacemaker, and former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who had died that morning. His words of many years ago embody the core message of this momentous African Women's Feminist Peace Conference. He said, there is no policy more effective in promoting development, health, and education than the empowerment of women and girls. And no policy is more important in preventing conflict or in achieving reconciliation after conflict has ended. My second meditation is inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh's wisdom regarding the relationship between conflict and climate crisis, or more positively, peace and a life-sustaining planet. His words, if we are not united in peace, we cannot save the planet. 3 years ago, Climate Action Now organized a conference bringing together the state of Connecticut's 350.org and a 70-year-old peace organization based in New Haven. And they asked me to speak on the relationship between what we call war and warming. So looking out to my audience of young climate change activists on one side and white-haired peace activists like us, not all of us, on the other, gathered for a talk and discussion on war and warming, I saw in the generational difference what many peace activists perceive, that peace, war, militarism, nuclear weapons are an agenda of another era, an earlier era, while progressive political energy today is galvanized by climate crisis. When I pointed this out, the difference in median age 32, median age 75, one young climate activist explained that in his lifetime, no nuclear weapons had been used while climate change had worsened. He seemed unaware of ongoing U.S. military conflicts in his lifetime because our news doesn't cover them. And those were anywhere. I estimated his age, and I looked up the estimate of conflicts that would have happened in his 32 years. And it varied anywhere from 10, of U.S. conflicts, anywhere from 10 to an estimated 134, depending on one's definition of U.S. involvement in conflict. Thus, our movements, climate action and peace action, largely work in silos, despite the actuality that war and fossil fuels have been fatally codependent since World War II. Oil is indispensable for war and militarism. Think of it as the lifeblood coursing through our foreign policy, a policy based on maintaining superpower status and confronting militarily those whom we perceive as challenging us. Since the late 1970s, the United States has spent $8 trillion solely protecting oil cargoes in the Persian Gulf region through ongoing naval patrols. We are on the brink of war with Iran for the same toxic reason, protecting access to Persian Gulf oil. Less so for us now because of the fracking boom beginning with Obama's administration, but rather to assure access for those with whom we are aligned economically, politically, and militarily. So a thumbnail sketch of recent U.S. spending confirms the axiom that war culture is a defining feature of U.S. politics. It is, in fact, some have called it a national religion. Dar has spoken of its roots in the near genocide of Native Americans and also in slavery, black slavery. So since, in 2016, an estimated $1 trillion was allocated to military defense, militarized national security, veterans care, and debt from recent wars. In that same year, a few billion dollars, they are crumbs from the master's table, were allocated to research and development for energy efficiency, renewable energy technologies. We all know budgets are moral documents, and military might is our national religion. Militarism is the most oil-intensive activity on the planet, and the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest single institutional contributor to climate crisis. Between 2003 and 2007, the Iraq War generated more carbon dioxide equivalent in greenhouse gas emissions each year than 139 of the world's countries released annually. Rebuilding Iraqi, now Syrian, Yemeni, Afghanistani schools, homes, businesses, bridges, roads, and hospitals polarized by these wars will require millions of tons of cement, the most fossil fuel intensive of all manufacturing industries. Many defense analysts of the West and NATO believe that war between, quote, the great powers, Russia and or China, is not only possible but also inevitable within a decade. I happen to get, I didn't subscribe to it, but I haven't canceled it, the Department of Defense newsletter daily. And this is where you step inside a worldview that is so at odds from not only activists in these issues, but general citizens as well. It's extraordinary. And they not only try to anticipate sort of war with these great powers, they like getting up and they like preparing for it. They're very excited. I hear there is a sort of energy, oddly, in the email messages and coverage by the Military Times magazine, etc. A high energy generator by, the next generation of weapons. And of course, the military industrial complex is right there, with their lobbyists, etc. So growing global militarization portends greater military buildup in Russia, China, NATO, and the Middle East. This is what's happening. We've just sold we sell so many weapons to Israel, but now to Saudi Arabia. encouraging NATO to contribute more to their own defense, and so consequently greater climate change crisis emissions. The United States expends 37% of the global military budget. That was a couple of years ago. And its military is estimated to contribute 5% of climate change emissions. Well, can we not then assume that the rest of the world's spending, weapons manufacturing, military exercise, and conflict combined to bring military-related fossil fuel emissions to nearly 15% of global crisis pollution? And it's only going up. Nor do these calculations include the military-industrial complex, their use of fossil fuel to make weapons and ammunition, nor the use of fossil fuels to clean up their Superfund sites, which are the majority, DODs and military-industrial, of our country's pollution, nor the excessive impact on climate change emissions of jet fuel and the fire-suppressing chemicals used in war and war exercises, nor the burning of oil wells and refineries in war, which the most memorable was the Gulf War. So, in conclusion for this second meditation, the U.S. habit and competence for war, of course, as Dar and so many others have said, is in the past near annihilation of Native Americans. And our habit and competence for war may be our world's nemesis. It's possible that nuclear weapons set off could finish the world before the impending climate crisis. And unless we do critical soul searching about our cultural and personal values and actively engage in transforming them, in the spirit, let us recall and honor the plenitude of activist, nonviolent movements in our society that have profoundly challenged the dominant patriarchal profile of our culture. I want to say something about the train. I thought about it a lot, how it disturbed people, how people took it so well. But then, having wandered into Fultonville last evening, and I saw all the trucks. I passed them also where they passed me when I was driving here. The trucking industry is concentrated in Fultonville with respect to weighing trucks and repairing trucks, etc., huge trucks. And I thought, at least there's still one train line that is carrying goods back and forth, because they've been nearly destroyed. That said, the railroad has a lot of confession and reconciliation, for it was built by slave laborers, Asians, new immigrants, Irish, and they usurped Native American land from east to west in building the railroads. So, but let us recall, because you've all been part of this, the activist, nonviolent movements in our society that have profoundly challenged the dominant patriarchal profile of our culture. These are the feminist, violence against women and equal rights movements, the civil rights, immigrant and indigenous rights movements, the anti-war and peace movement, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock water protectors, progressive media, peace and justice studies, progressive labor and health workers, the multi-dimensioned environmental movement, the co-op, sustainable agriculture, transition town movements, and the pervasive climate crisis activism. Our ongoing challenge, it always has been, is how to build voice, social cohesion, and public influence for our shared values of a sense of human community, our core identity as humans within nature, and our empathy with the exploited, and our thirst for equality and justice for all. My third meditation is motivated by a book I read recently. It was actually a book I reviewed for the online publication Truth Dig. In Burning Up, A Global History of Fossil Fuel Consumption, the author Simon Pervani sets out to plumb the political, social, and economic causes, that is, the large structural causes of what he calls the madness that is producing global warming. For example, he says, though individuals are consumers of fossil fuel for electricity, heat, air conditioning, goods and services, he contends that we do so in the context of social and economic systems over which we have little control. Among his most cogent examples of political and economic elite driving climate change is the calculated design of cities for the car, now replicated throughout every continent. I saw it in Africa when I was there, the streets clogged with cars, as well as carts and women walking with baskets on their head to sell food. Car-centered transport in the United States between World War I and World War II became a template for the world and shaped fossil fuel consumption patterns internationally. Industry consolidated from 88 car makers, this is in the US in 1921, to 10 by 1935, with the big three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler encompassing 90% of the market and ranking among the most powerful corporate lobbies in the world. In the US, they bought up and shut down trolley systems. That was within a period of 10 years. And they helped displace railways with road transport for buses, trucks, and cars. This stimulated car-centered urban design, urban renewal in the case of older cities, and was embedded in the 1950s mushrooming of car-oriented suburbs. Government invested in supporting this by building fossil fuel-intensive roads and highways through cities with our taxes. Manufacturers designed cars for obsolescence, and industry pioneered the annual style of changing cars. All, he writes, were the result of corporate strategies to stimulate consumer demand, even during the Depression. I read recently that Uber and Lyft, the ride-sharing programs, are siphoning riders from city subways and trains, and thereby also adding pollution and further congestion. As for the future, as I mentioned earlier, 55% of the world's people now live in cities with a projected increase to 68% by 2050. Car-based urbanization drives consumption of fossil fuels, especially because cities are not designed centrally for public transportation. Thus, it is governments, developers, and corporate interests, not the individuals who live in these cities, that shape the design of cities, constrain individual choice, and have driven climate crisis. Corporate capitalism and political elites have led us by their dominant choice of fossil fuel-based energy and technology to the point of burning up. The author Pirani urges us to take the road less traveled. He writes, the decisive actor must be society, all of us collectively, rather than the political elites. So I'm reminded here of the precocious Greta Thunberg, the now 16-year-old Swedish climate activist who spoke brilliantly at the UN Climate Conference in 2018. She is on a solar-powered boat, taking 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic to come to the UN and I think travel throughout. She took an academic year off from school to speak throughout the country. Every day, the world uses some 100 million barrels of oil, yet, as she said to the UN, there are no politics to change that, no politics to keep oil in the ground. Since our leaders are behaving like children, she said, we have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago. There is no time to continue down this road of madness. We have come to let them know that change is coming, whether they like it or not. I saw her give this. I looked at the faces, when the camera would show you, of the UN adults in the room. A combination of some smiles and some abashment. Could we shut her down? Since her speech, millions of young students across the world are following her example, striking from school one day a week to pressure their governments to abide by their own weak commitments to reduce climate change emissions. I would also point to a few recent standouts of taking action and trying to take back their future. The pragmatic Green New Deal, the meteoric rise of young political action groups like Sunrise Movement in the US and Species Extinction, and the infectious young climate action lawsuit, Juliana versus the United States. It was filed by children and young adults against the government for failing to limit the effects of climate change on human and environmental health, thus foreclosing on their future. I think with all that we've heard, we all feel this way. May they be spared the time needed, given the rapidity of climate breakdown and the loss of biodiversity, to disrupt the hold of corporate wealth and power and government. I have to hold on to a second definition of hope by Václav Havel, and I think this is the hope that they have left and that we have left. Hope is the engaged heart, actively seeking, and then you fill in. I have generally put peace in there, but I would also add seeking to nurture a garden of resilience, and that's about the best that they can do. But I do fear, as Dara has said, that more time is needed than remains. And so let us make the most, imperatively, of what we have and can do now, with an emphasis on excellence in every endeavor. And I will finish with the two principles I mentioned. Let us honor, hour by hour, day by day, the two golden rules. Love thy neighbor as thyself, love thy nature as thyself. What we care for, we will grow to resemble. What we resemble will hold us, as long as we have life on this earth and when we are no longer. Thank you. This is a very important conference. It is dimensioned because of the inclusion of poetry, music, ideas, love, sense of community, the care of people preparing the food, and I feel very fortunate, blessed to be here. Thank you.